Hello, welcome into your next GCSE history lesson. We're looking at the development of the United States. Last time we looked at the affluence of post-war America. In this lesson, we're going to compare some of the plenty of that affluent society with some of the poverty that still existed in American life. Before we do that, fire up your low-stakes quiz, please, and do some recap on what we learned last lesson. Pause the video to do that, unpause, and we'll carry on with this lesson. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Just a reminder that we are on to the second part of our course. We are looking at this bit. You can see it right down the end here, what the exam board calls poverty amidst plenty, which is what we're going to look at today, which is the last part of the this section. Don't forget, you can use your knowledge organizer to help you. We're looking at box 7 and box 8 today. You can also use the list of keywords that's at the back of that knowledge organizer to help you if you get stuck. Where are we with our timeline? Well, we've been through the Depression and the Wall Street crash, Hoover and Roosevelt. We looked at World War II, and now we're in this period of post-war affluence from about 1945 to about 1960, a period of wealth in American life. Today, though, we're going to ask this question. Who lived the American dream in the 1950s? I'd like to write down this title, please, and also I'd like you to write down this definition, the American dream. What is the American dream? Well, the American dream is a very particular idea in American life that sets America apart from maybe other countries in the world. It's sometimes called American exceptionalism. It's the idea that in America, everyone can become wealthy if they work hard enough and they're talented and so on. That unlike societies in Europe, or maybe more class-based, America, everybody could become wealthy if they worked hard enough and were talented. Pause the video. I'd like to write down the title and that keyword and definition because it's going to be important for us as we go on. Okay, once you've done that, let's move on with the lesson then. So, in today's lesson, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at two very specific aspects, features of the American dream in the 1950s. And those are suburbanization and consumerism. I'm going to come on and explain what each of those things is in turn during this lesson. But we're also going to see how some people in American life did not share in this American dream. They were shut out from the suburbanization and the consumerism of the 1950s and 1960s. The title that our exam board gives to this idea is poverty amidst plenty. Poverty, people being poor, amidst, in the middle of, plenty, wealth. So people being poor in the middle of other people being wealthy. And we're going to look specifically at one group that did not share in the riches of America in the 1950s and 60s, and that is African Americans, Black Americans. Before we do that, though, let's think about the other side of the equation, the American dream. The first thing we're going to look at is this process of suburbanization. I'd like you to write down this keyword. Suburbanization is the process of people moving from cities to the suburbs. Now, what are the suburbs? Here's another keyword for you to write down, please. The suburbs are wealthy, affluent areas, residential areas, places where people live, around the edges of cities. So around the edges of big cities, these residential areas, lots of houses, spaced out on lots of there's ample land in America around the edges of cities. Before we go on, can you write down these two keywords and their definitions, please? Okay, let's continue. Pause if you need more time to write your keywords down. I'm going to talk to you about suburbanization, looking at one particular example. This is an example that's close to my heart. In longer ago than I care to remember, when I left university, I did an undergraduate degree in history, and I stayed on to do a master's degree in American history. And I did some research on a city called Buffalo, which is in the north of America. It's right over the border from Canada. It's up here. It's in New York State. So New York City is down this end of New York State. Buffalo's all the way up here, to the other end. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Buffalo's history in the 20th century because it helps show us how the suburbs developed. So this is a helicopter shot of Buffalo in the 1950s. This is Buffalo. This is downtown Buffalo here in the foreground. These high-rise buildings, and then you can see the residential areas over here. Over the other side of the river, that's Canada. It gets very cold and very snowy in Buffalo in the winter. It's up in the north. Before the Second World War, Buffalo was an industrial city. It was polluted. It had slums. And people who lived in the center of the city did not have a great time. This is an image of some industrial workers living in Buffalo in the 1930s during the Depression. Hoovervilles in Buffalo, crime rates were high, poverty rates were high. It was very overcrowded. People were crammed into slum housing. After the Second World War, this started to change. This is a map of Erie County, which Buffalo is in. The area in blue there, that's the area roughly taken up by the city of Buffalo. After the Second World War, suburbs started to develop around the outside of Buffalo. Places called Tonawanda, Amherst, Clarence, Lancaster, West Seneca, Orchard Park, and Hamburg. These almost towns in their own right, but suburbs where people could live so they didn't have to live in the city, where there was lots of slums, it was dirty, there was high crime. These suburbs look like this. All single homes planned together on grids of streets, taking up hundreds of square miles. You have to have a car to get around. When I went there, I didn't have a car. I had to walk down these long roads without any pavements because it's not designed for you to walk between these houses. And there's nothing but houses, really. It's a place for people to live. A drive for people to park their cars, nice lawns, but it's very spacious. The housing is much better than in the centre of the city. Everyone's got their own house. Everyone's got their own front garden. Everyone's got their own backyard, and there's not the overcrowding that existed in the city itself. Why were people able to afford this? Well, because of the FHA. Remember, the FHA was one of our alphabet agencies, the Federal Housing Administration. It gave cheap loans to people in the city so they could afford to move out to the suburbs. And the FHA encouraged people to get cheap loans to move to the suburbs. It was government sponsored, incentivizing people, giving people cheap money so they could go to the suburbs. The GI Bill also gave cheap mortgages to veterans so they could also move out to the suburbs. Places like Amherst, here in the north of Buffalo, maybe only had a few hundred residents before the Second World War. After the Second World War, there were thousands of people living there. It expanded and expanded and expanded. As a result of people living in the suburbs, they had their nice homes, as you can see here, everyone with their nice homes in the suburbs, and that meant they needed stuff. So this is an advert for a heating system, but you needed a car if you lived in the suburbs. You had a big house that you needed to fill with stuff. This stimulated the economy. Also, the government built freeways, that's the American word for motorway, that connected up the suburbs with the city so that people could get to work and then get back out of the city to go and live in a nice house. So during the 1950s, Buffalo was carved up with these huge freeways which would take people into the city. They didn't have to look at anything that was in the city, which wasn't very nice, to their jobs downtown, and they could go straight back out again to the suburbs. They didn't have to worry about all the problems in the city. So the government is supporting suburbanization in two ways here. One, by the FHA, giving people cheap mortgages, but also the freeways that take people in and out of the city. Okay. Before we move on, let's just write some sentences about suburbanization. It's a fragments task. I would like you to turn these fragments into sentences. The way you do that is you add some words to the beginning and or the end. So let's do the first one together. One, was overcrowded and. So I think about, it's not the suburbs that's overcrowded, it was Buffalo, the cities, before the Second World War were overcrowded. And what else could I say in addition to overcrowded? I could say maybe there's high crime, or that there was lots of poverty. So you might write something like this. Housing in the cities was overcrowded and cramped. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is to pause the video now. I'd like you to write sentences for the remaining 4 fragments that are on the screen there, and unpause when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Let's look at what we could have written. Number 2, I said in the post-war period, many Americans moved to the suburbs. Homes in the suburbs were more spacious and higher quality than in the city. These homes were paid for with cheap mortgages provided by the FHA. You could also say the GI Bill. And then finally, the government built freeways to connect the cities to the suburbs. Think about freeways. Freeways is American motorways, just like autobahns are German motorways. So we're learning different words for motorways in different parts of the world. So this is suburbanization. This is the first of our features of the American dream. So living the American dream in the 1950s meant getting out of the city into nice suburban housing. And the government helped you doing that by giving you cheap mortgages via the FHA and building a nice road, freeway, to get you there. The other aspect of the American dream in the 1950s was closely connected to suburbanization, and that was consumerism. Now, what is consumerism? I'd like to write down that word, consumerism. Consumerism comes from the word consumer. A consumer is someone who gets something, buys something. It's very similar to the word consumption that we looked at the start of this course, people buying things. Consumerism is an obsession with consumer goods, stuff you can buy. American society in the 1950s became obsessed with consumer goods. Now, this might be quite hard for us to understand because we are a consumerist society now. We are obsessed with consumer goods, buying stuff. We've got adverts everywhere bombarding us with stuff to buy. We've got Amazon telling us to buy things and allowing us to buy things very quickly and cheaply. But this was new in the 1950s, and it was new because for the first time, lots of people had lots of money. Let's talk a little bit about the forms this took in America in the post-war period. Firstly, consumerism was possible because, as we saw in our last lesson, weekly wages were increasing. Americans were getting more money. So from the 1950 to 1960, weekly wages increased from $55 to $80. But with that extra money, Americans were buying new things. And new technology meant there was more new stuff to buy. The examples that we're going to use, television, color television for the first time. But also things like refrigerators and freezers that allowed you to store all your plentiful food. These were new technological inventions, the height of technology in the 1950s that were starting to become not just something that the very rich could afford, but something that everybody could afford. Cars. Now, what's the connection between consumerism and cars? If you live in the suburbs, you have to have a car. The only way you get around is by the car. Your whole existence has been planned for everyone to have cars. Right? You can't walk anywhere from the suburbs. There are no real buses. There's no trains. The only way you get from the suburbs to your job is in a car. The only way you get the kids to school is in a car. So everyone had to have a car. The car companies, though, they started, and again, this is difficult for us to spot because it happens today as well. Rather than just having a car, every year they released a new car. So here's a 1957 Chevrolet. And then the 1958 Chevrolet. Aha, that's much better. But then the 1959 Chevrolet. Basically the same, but looks slightly different. 1960, new Chevrolet. So new models every year meant that people had to carry on spending money if they wanted to appear on the cutting edge. Now, this is very familiar with us. Think about iPhones. What are we on now, like the iPhone 12 or something like that? Every year, a new one. Everyone goes, oh, I've got to have this new one. It's marginally better than the previous one, which means that everyone's spending their money and people are making lots of profits. That's what's happening with cars in the 1950s in America. The companies that are doing this are mainly responsible, are some of the most powerful companies in America. These are what's called the Big Three. The Big Three are the 3 powerful car companies that are based in Detroit, in Michigan, in the north of America. They are GM, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. Those are the big 3 car companies. And in order to keep you buying stuff, they do 2 things. One, they spend lots of money on advertising, making their cars look very attractive. And two, they release a new model of their car every year so that people are incentivized to buy new cars rather than just sticking with their old one, which after a few years begins to look old. This stimulates consumption, it increases demand, people get jobs building these cars in the factories, making these televisions and refrigerators, and the whole economy becomes wealthier. Let's turn some fragments into sentences. 5 fragments there. Pause the video now, turn them into full sentences. Okay, welcome back. This is what my sentences look like. Yours might look similar. So wages increased from $55 per week to $80 per week in the 1950s. That's a statistic that you need to remember. Number 2, Americans bought new products such as TVs and refrigerators. Number 3, got the 3 companies there. The big 3 car companies were GM, Ford, and Chrysler. The big 3 released new models each year, and consumerism led to increased demand, which, why is demand good? It stimulated the economy. Okay, let's try and put this into practice then. How might we use this? Well, we're going to look at question 2 question here. So again, it's a how far did things change? Remember, this is 6 marks. You've got to show both sides. You've got to show some change and not some change. So what do you have to do? You have to link to the question. You have to give an overall judgment. You have to give an evidence of some change on one side, evidence of no change. You've got to explain why things changed and why things didn't change. Here's half of an answer. I wrote this half of an answer. I've got and it's written about suburbanization. So let me show you how it meets the success criteria. So the first thing I've done in the first sentence is I've linked to the question. Yeah, I've used the words for the question. So I've got lives of American people improved. I've got the dates to show the examiner that I'm answering the question. But I've also made an overall judgment. I said the lives of some American people improved, but others were left behind. That's a judgment, right? You don't always have to use the language of extent. I've said, some people improved their lives, but others left behind. That's my judgment. Then in the first paragraph, I've put some evidence of things changing, right? And I've used this phrase. On the one hand, I said that their lives improved because of suburbanization. And then I put one sentence of detail. Cheap mortgages, FHA, GI Bill, move to the suburbs. That's my specific detail. Then I put my explanation. This improved the lives of the American people because they now had better living conditions and could afford good housing. Now, the thing you should be saying is, well, this isn't a very good answer, sir, because it's not got the evidence of no change. And you're absolutely right. This is the first half of an answer. We're going to see later in the lesson how we turn it into a full answer. So here's my model. And notice that I've not talked about suburbanization and consumerism because that would be way too much. Right, I've got 6 minutes to write this. I've just focused on one thing, suburbanization. Conveniently, this gives you the opportunity to practice by writing a paragraph about consumerism. So what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to write out the whole of this answer. So starting with, you can copy down my judgment, my link to the question. On one hand, the lives of some American people improved significantly because of consumerism. You've got to give me a sentence or two about what consumerism was, talk to me about the big 3, talk to me about the advertising, the new technology, and then tell me how this improved the lives of the American people. I want you to pause the video now. I want you to write this paragraph about consumerism and then unpause once you're done. Okay, welcome back. This is what I wrote. I put in the statistic about wages increasing and people using their wealth to buy new goods such as fridges, cars, and televisions. But you might have written about the big 3, about advertising and so on. Then your explanation. This improved the lives of the American people because it stimulated the economy by increasing consumption, creating more jobs and higher profits. I've used some of those key words, those key concepts to explain how this helped the American economy. Okay, so we've seen very clearly how suburbanization and consumerism were key features of the American dream. But as I said at the start, we're also going to look at how there was poverty amidst this plenty. Not everyone was living the American dream of the affluence of the post-war period. Now, there are several groups that we could look at, but because it fits in nicely with the rest of our course, we're going to look at African Americans. Before we move on from this slide, though, this phrase, poverty amidst plenty, it's in the specification for this course. And what I really don't want you to do is I really don't want you to know loads about this, but then you see this phrase, poverty amidst plenty in the exam, and you don't know what it relates to. So I want you to write down this keyword and a definition here that's on the screen. Poverty amidst plenty is the idea that whilst most people were wealthy, others remained poor. Poverty amidst, in the middle of, plenty. Pause the video, write down that keyword before we go on. Now we're going to look our example, as I said, is going to be African Americans. African Americans are Black Americans. They're usually the descendants of enslaved people. As we saw in our first lesson, the British, but also later the independent America, brought millions of enslaved people to America and the Caribbean during a period that spanned about 300 years from the late 1500s up to the mid 1800s. And the transatlantic slave trade led to the death of millions of people, but it also led to a changing in the population of places like the United States, where in parts of the United States there was a huge Black population. After the Civil War, enslaved people were free, slavery was ended, but that was not the end of inequality or oppression of African Americans. Now, most Black Americans are descended from enslaved people. Some Black Americans obviously are the children or the descendants of Black people who migrated from other parts of the world. So like, for example, Barack Obama. Barack Obama was not the descendant of enslaved people. His dad moved from Kenya in the 1950s to America. Most African Americans in the 1960s lived in the South, in the yellow area on this map. That's because the states such as Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, these have been the states where slaves had grown cotton in the 19th century. And so therefore, by the middle of the 20th century, most people were still living here in the South. This was a problem for African Americans because in the South, something existed called Jim Crow. Jim Crow laws were state laws that introduced by each state. So like Mississippi had a set of laws, and Alabama had a set of laws, and Texas had a set of laws that made African Americans into second-class citizens. In other words, the end of slavery had not been the emancipating, the freeing moment that African Americans had hoped. Despite their best efforts, they had not managed to gain equality in the 19th century. And in fact, the white Southerners who began to run the Southern states in the late 19th century had introduced laws that put African Americans back as second-class citizens. The Jim Crow laws are incredibly complex and they link into each other. We need to know basically three features of the Jim Crow laws. The first is segregation. Segregation was the physical separation of Black and white people in America. Segregation was a law in southern states. You can see here's a drinking fountain that says for colored only, and you can see at the top there's another drinking fountain on the other side, which is the white drinking fountain. The Supreme Court had said in 1896 that segregation was fine and that states could segregate if they wanted to. Segregation applied to not only drinking fountains, but also public facilities such as toilets, swimming pools, schools, buses, trains. In theory, the facilities were separate but equal. In other words, there was a separate Black and white school in every town, but they were the same. But in reality, they weren't. Black facilities were usually much less good quality, and that meant, as a result, Black people were treated unfairly in the South. Why couldn't African Americans do anything about this? Well, because of disenfranchisement. This is a great long word that means something very simple. Disenfranchisement means stopping people from voting. Southern states stopped African Americans voting systematically. It means they had plans to do it. It wasn't accidental. One of the ways they do this, as you can see in this picture, is they introduced literacy tests, which they gave to African Americans. They said you had to be literate, you had to be able to read and write in order to be able to vote. And it asked them all sorts of confusing questions, like the questions on here. Look at the first question. Draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And some of the tests were impossible to complete, but they were only given to African Americans. When African Americans failed them, they were told they couldn't vote. All sorts of other methods were also introduced to make sure that African Americans found it very difficult to vote in the South, and that they couldn't vote against these laws, so that they couldn't change them. The other thing that was stopping African Americans from changing these laws was the threat of violence. Lynching, the public murder of African Americans, which is often not considered a crime by local white police forces. And when I say the public murder, I mean that if a black man, it was almost always a black man, was decided, a mob decided that he was guilty of something, graphic and horrific executions would be organized, and not in private, but sometimes people were put on like whole trains and buses to bring people to spectate. People who were targeted for lynching were people who stood up for black rights. So if you stood up for yourself, there was a danger that you would be murdered. These three aspects meant that African Americans were second-class citizens in the South. What I'd like you to do is write down the 4 definitions on this page. So pause the video and do that, please. Okay, welcome back. Now you've written your definitions, let's do some practice. I want you to write these 3 sentences, but complete them. Pause the video, come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Here are your answers. Most African Americans lived in the South. The Jim Crow laws were laws introduced by southern states to make African Americans second-class citizens, and the problems facing African Americans included segregation, lynching, and disenfranchisement. Okay, if you need to change or add, you can pause and do that, but let's move on and now look at how things start to change after the Second World War. Last lesson we learned about the GI Bill. The GI Bill we learned included lots of benefits for veterans of the American Armed Forces. They got cheap mortgages, so they could buy homes, and they got free tuition, so they could get better jobs. African Americans also fought in the Second World War. They fought mainly, as we're going to find out in our next couple of lessons, in segregated units, but there were almost 1 million African Americans in the American Armed Forces by the end of World War II. African Americans did not get the benefits of the GI Bill. Banks refused to lend them money. Universities in the South refused to allow African Americans to enroll on college programs. What did this mean? It meant that African Americans were left behind. Whilst the government was giving benefits and lifting the white population out of poverty by giving them cheap mortgages and giving them education, African Americans were not benefiting from this. This was not an accident. This was government policy. Let's practice. During the Second World War, African Americans, what were they doing? What did the GI Bill offer to white veterans? And then what was the problem with that? I want you to pause. I want you to write these 3 sentences. Come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Here's my answers. So during the Second World War, African Americans served in the armed forces. You can include that. The GI Bill offered white veterans free college tuition and cheap mortgages. You could also include the 5220, the unemployment benefit, in there as well. However, African American veterans did not get these benefits. So they'd fought for America, but they did not receive the benefits that they were expecting. Finally, after the Second World War, partly as a result of trying to find new jobs, but also to get out of the Jim Crow South, African Americans moved in great numbers to other parts of the country. To the West, places like California, to the Midwest, to cities like Chicago and Detroit, and to the North and the Northeast, to places like New York and Buffalo. They did this in the expectation of being able to escape the racism of the South. In the North and the Midwest and the West, there were not Jim Crow laws. It was not the law that there was segregation. It was not the law that African Americans couldn't vote. So they hoped that by escaping the South, African Americans hoped they would find new lives and more equality in other parts of the country. However, this did not come to pass. Segregation was not the law in the North. However, it still existed. This map is a map of Buffalo, but it's got all the streets in there. Each dot on the map is one person, and the color of the dot shows their racial or ethnic background. So you can see the blue dots on the map are white people in Buffalo, where they live. The green dots are black people in Buffalo. The red dots are Asian people in Buffalo, and the yellow dots are Hispanic people in Buffalo, people of Mexican descent. What you can see in this map is that Buffalo is heavily segregated. Main Street is the dividing line. One side of Main Street, white population, mainly. Other side of Main Street, black population. There are almost no white people living on this side of Main Street. This is a highly segregated city. Once you get out here, this is the suburbs, right, where the population is again white. This process is mirrored in other cities around the country. Slightly confusing here, the dots have changed color. So our blue dots here are African Americans, and the green dots are white Americans. But you can see here in New York, dense African American population here in Brooklyn. This is Harlem. Population here, highly segregated. The same is true in Philadelphia. So downtown Philadelphia, quite mixed, but huge areas where it's just a black area. This is the west side of Philadelphia. In Washington, D.C., basically there's a line down the middle of Washington, D.C. On one side, white people live here. On the other side, black people live here. What about in Chicago? In Chicago, north of the city, white area. Over here, Hispanic area. West side of Chicago, black area. South side of Chicago, black area. There's no mixing going on here. Okay, this is segregation. These maps are not from the 1950s. These maps are from 2010. This is the current situation in America. American cities are heavily segregated, and they are in many ways more segregated now than they were in the 1950s. But the process that got us here started in the 1940s and 50s after the Second World War. Now, why did this happen? It was not the law. It was not the law that African Americans couldn't live next door or in the same neighborhoods as white Americans. How did it happen? The answer is the FHA. We've seen how the FHA gave cheap mortgages for Americans to move to the suburbs. However, the FHA also produced maps like this. The maps like this showed how likely you were to get a mortgage depending on where you lived. These red areas are African American areas where lots of black people lived. The FHA had a policy known as redlining. Redlining was a policy of not giving cheap mortgages to African Americans. In these areas of heavy African American population, the FHA did not give mortgages, which meant that white Americans were able to leave the crowded city and move to the nice suburbs. Black Americans, they wanted to, they couldn't. They couldn't get the mortgages from the FHA. This is not an accident. This is the government in the 1940s and 50s saying, we are not going to give the money to move to the suburbs to African Americans. They are going to stay in the city. What this created was these segregation maps that you've seen before. It created two Americas. It created a ghetto, an inner city area that was almost exclusively populated by black Americans. Many of them wanted to leave the ghetto. They couldn't. They couldn't get the loans from the FHA. And a suburb. Suburbs, mainly white areas, sometimes exclusively white areas. People were able to move there because of the FHA. Only white people. In the ghetto, there was high unemployment. There was high levels of crime. There were poor schools, and there was poverty. People wanted to move away from the ghetto. They couldn't afford it because of the color of their skin. In the suburbs, there was wealth, there were good schools, there were universities, and there were more opportunities for people to get on than there were in the ghetto. African Americans could not access the suburbs because they could not get the loans and the cheap mortgages from the FHA. This was not a mistake. This was the policy of the American government. Okay, lots to take in. 3 sentences. Use the sentence starters to help you. Pause the video. Off you go. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. Here are my answers. The FHA did not give cheap mortgages to African Americans. What's called redlining. The ghetto was the poor black area of the city with high crime and unemployment, whereas suburbs have more opportunities and lower crime rates. Okay, now we've taken in these ideas. Let's finish off the exam question that we were looking at before. So you've written me a paragraph explaining how the lives of the American people did change because of consumerism. Now we're going to write the second paragraph, and we're going to say, on the other hand, and I want you to tell me about the lives of African Americans and how they did not change. You're not going to be able to include everything. You could tell me about Jim Crow, you could tell me about segregation, you could tell me about the FHA and redlining, and then explain that for me. Pause the video, come back when you're done. Okay, welcome back. Pause if you need more time. This is what I wrote. African Americans did not share any affluence. I wrote about Jim Crow and I wrote about ghettos. And I said this shows that not everyone's lives improved because African Americans remain second-class citizens. You can pause the video here, check with what what you've written against what I've written. If you're done, you can fire up the exit ticket and recap what we've done today.